boys and girls, and welcome to this episode of The Invisible Critic. I'm your host, The Invisible Critic, from North New Jersey, and this is the sub-series, The Hidden History of Globalism. Now, I know last time I said that today we were going to talk about the Charles Darwin's phony baloney theory of evolution. We're going to do that next time. There's something that I do not want to skip. You know, sometimes when we talk about this globalism, we tend to focus too much on the European or American elements of it, because we as Westerners, that's where we're from. But we don't want to be ethnocentric, because it's a big world, and there's a lot was going on in the Far East, India and China and Burma, Malaysia, and it's very important to talk about it. Which brings us to this family known as the Rothschilds of the East. Not many people have heard of them, but they was big, probably second only to the Rothschilds. They're right up there amongst the super elite, super wealthy. These evil, rancid sons of bitches, the Sassoons. Okay, let me tell you about the Sassoons. They started out centuries ago in modern day Iraq, in Baghdad. They was treasurers to the big shot kings and everything. They was Jewish bankers essentially, and they were starting to run the show. And in time, people got sick of them, and they turned anti-Semitic. So they started the Sassoons. They left Baghdad and settled in Bombay, which today is known as Mumbai in India. And it was two brothers who left. One went to Syria, actually, Joseph, and he became big in various businesses, textiles and so on. But the real big one, this guy right here, David Sassoon, arrives in India. He sets up various operations, but the main business of the Sassoon family that made them immensely wealthy. I mean, if the Rothschilds are the richest family in world history, they might be number two, the Sassoons. And they made their money primarily in opium, dope. Yes, that's what they did. They ran a big trade it was called the India-Sino opium trade. It came out of the ports of Mumbai and went up the Indian Ocean here to like Hong Kong and Shanghai. That's where they set up the operations. They set up operations in Mumbai, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And they was doping people up. There was drug pushers, and they was getting rich. David Sassoon. And he had 8 sons. And with his ill-gotten money, built a massive synagogue in Mumbai. Later on, the family built a port in Mumbai, it's Bombay. And they're just selling dope. And as he's doing this, he's also engaging in philanthropy. And that's how he's building influence with local government leaders and so on. But it's all that usual phony philanthropy. How can you call yourself a philanthropist when you're destroying people's lives selling opium? And look what was going on in China. These are real images. Millions of people, estimated 12 million Chinese, doped up. And mind you, at this time, China had the largest economy in the world. That's right. And the British, through the Sassoons, were gaining influence. And China's going down. I mean, there's in the cosmopolitan areas of China, like Shanghai and Hong Kong, as much as 20% of the people were, they were dope heads. Look at these images here. That's what's going on at the time. It's a big problem. Look at this cartoon. It depicts a British force-feeding a Chinese opium. And the thing is, it really wasn't the British. It was the British East India Company, which was a private entity, which had its own army. And its major stockholders were like the Sassoons and the Rothschilds. They were the one doing this. And they kind of did their own deal independently. And finally, it gets so bad. The emperor of China says, hey, I'm cracking down. No more. He even writes a letter to Queen Victoria. Hey, please, cut it out with this, selling all this shit to my people. You're killing my country. Little does he know that Victoria ain't got no power. She don't run England. The Rothschilds run England. And they're hooked up with the Sassoons. Here's an image of the first Opium War. There were 2 Opium Wars. And it's very simple. When the Chinese cracked down, the British said, open up your markets again. And they forced them to open up those markets to sell the opium. And they did it through It became known as gunboat diplomacy. The Chinese could not resist. The British had more modern, advanced weaponry, so they won those wars very easily. The Chinese did not relent. Later on, there was a second Opium War. They kept trying to ban the trade, and the British kept forcing the markets open. Okay, and this is Sassoon. He's running the deal. Let's see. Now, Sassoon has a son named Abdullah. He comes back to England, and he becomes a baron. They give him a title. He changes his name to Albert. Yeah, he's an Englishman now. You see how they do? They go from Iraq to India to China to London. They got no home. The whole world is their playground. Now, Albert, he was the first baron. His son, the second Baron Albert, marries Caroline Aline de Rothschild. She is the granddaughter of James de Rothschild, one of the 5 Rothschild sons we talked about in an earlier episode, who set up the big bank in Naples. So the Sassoons, they're intermingling. See, they married the Rothschilds, and Rothschilds married the Schiffs and the Warburgers. This one big mafia crime family. They all marry each other, and they run the world. And they were behind the Opium Wars. And, you know, in that part of the world, to this day, there's a lot of resentment towards the British in China, in India, in Malaysia, in Burma. But it wasn't the British. The big picture was the British East India Company, which was owned by these big Jewish multi-billionaires, the Rothschilds and the Sassoons, kind of giving the British a bad name. Because, you know, the Queen had no control over this stuff. 1857 in India, there is a mutiny against the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company, if you'll recall, 1773, the Boston Tea Party, it was the American colonists. They stormed a ship of the British East India Company in Boston, and they threw all the tea in the harbor. It's the same British East India Company. Okay? It's a very nefarious institution. And it's a private stock company. And at its peak, it had 260,000-man army in the Far East. And they controlled territory, and they controlled the local politics. It created enormous resentment in the area. But it would be like, imagine a private company, or imagine someone like Jeff Bezos if he raised his own 250,000-man army and started taking over countries and governments around the world. Well, that's how the British East India Company was. And the true bosses were Rothschilds, Sassoons, and others. Here's an image that depicts, the Chinese uprising against the British. And in the Second Opium War, the British were joined by the French. So you see, again, they're all hooked up. The French Rothschilds, the British Rothschilds, the Sassoons. The Sassoons intermingling with the Rothschilds. One of the granddaughters of the Sassoons back in England, she owned 2 newspapers, so they're also influencing the media. But it's interesting that the Sassoons are not as well known as the Rothschilds, but they're big. They're very big. This cartoon from the period depicts a Chinaman, and you see these European powers cutting up China for influence, and he's in the background yelling for them to stop. And this was the beginning of what became known as the Century of Humiliation among Chinese. I'll put a link on that subject down below. But again, it's almost like the British and the European aristocrats and people getting a bad rap for the actions which were really orchestrated by the Sassoons and the Rothschilds, selling their dope, getting people in debt. Oh, it's horrible. Now, back up a little bit to the patriarch David Sassoon. When that son of a bitch died, dignitaries that he carried around in his pocket like quarters and dimes, he owned them from all over Asia. They came to his funeral. There was his tomb in India. It looks like a freaking skyscraper. And, the reason he's so renowned, he's buying people up. He's doing all this phony philanthropy. But you never forget, this family, which is still around to this day, now they got a branch in New York. They made their money destroying people's lives with dope. Just like the Rothschilds made their money destroying people's lives with credit. And, they amass this fortune. They buy up governments. And that's the essence of the New World Order. But now you know about the Sassoon family and the Opium Wars. So, next time, we're going to talk about the phony baloney theory of evolution and how it all ties into this new world order and what its true motives were. So until the next time, this is your host, the Invisible Critic, signing off.